Please don't let him hurt my baby. Those were the words my granddaughter sobbed into the phone the night everything finally came apart. I could hear the chaos behind her voice, a man shouting, something heavy crashing against a wall, and a fear I recognized instantly because I'd heard that exact pitch of terror before, just never from someone I loved. I told her to stay on the line, grabbed my truck keys off the hook by the door, and drove the 11 minutes to her house faster than I should have. By the time I pulled into the driveway, her husband Tyler was already face down on the porch with my forearm locked across the back of his neck, and 2 patrol cars were pulling up with their lights washing red and blue across the front of the house. He kept screaming that I jumped him from behind, that I was crazy, that somebody needed to arrest the old man. The officers weren't looking at him, though. They were looking at me. One of them, a younger guy with a buzz cut, noticed how I had Tyler's wrist angled, not twisted to break, just controlled. Just enough. He glanced at his partner, then back at me, and asked the question I'd been dodging for almost 30 years. "Sir, were you law enforcement? Military?" I kept my breathing even. "Federal," I said. That was all. I didn't mention the 17 years with the Marshal service. Didn't mention the fugitive task force. Didn't mention the nights I'd knocked on doors, not knowing what was waiting behind them. At 66, you learn that silence is its own kind of armor, especially when you've spent half your life trying to set it down. 3 months before that night, nobody in our family would have believed it could end this way. Least of all Tyler. Tyler Briggs was 34, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who filled a doorway and made sure you noticed. He managed a chain of car dealerships outside Tulsa and had a laugh that boomed across a room before you even heard the joke. When he started dating my granddaughter Hannah, I wanted to like him, genuinely wanted to. After my son Mark and his wife were killed in a highway accident when Hannah was 19, she became more than a granddaughter to me. She became the only family I had left worth getting up for in the morning. So when she brought Tyler around, smiling in a way I hadn't seen since before the funeral, I let a lot of things slide. The way he talked over her at dinner. The way he checked his phone whenever she spoke too long. The way her laugh got smaller and more careful the longer they were together. I told myself every young couple has rough patches. That excuse cost me more time than I'm proud of. My name is Earl Whitfield. I'm 66 years old, a widower, and I live alone in a small farmhouse outside a town in eastern Oklahoma where everybody waves from their porches and nobody locks their doors except me out of habit. Most folks around here know me as the quiet man who fixes tractors for free and shows up at the diner every Tuesday morning for the breakfast special. They see me feeding my 2 goats. They see me at church, 3rd pew from the back. That's the whole picture as far as they're concerned, and for a long time I preferred it that way. I spent 17 years as a Deputy U.S. Marshal, most of it chasing people who didn't want to be found. The last several years training new deputies how to clear a room without getting themselves killed. When my wife Loretta passed from a stroke 6 years ago, something in me just stopped reaching outward. I retired the year after. I told myself I'd earned the quiet. What I didn't admit was that the quiet had started to feel like hiding. Hannah had told me a little, here and there, in the months before that night. Nothing dramatic. Just small comments dropped and quickly walked back. Tyler doesn't love it when I make plans without him. Tyler says I spend too much on little things. Tyler gets in a mood sometimes, but it's just stress from work. I'd nod and let it pass. The way you let a hairline crack in a windshield pass, telling yourself it isn't going to spread. What I didn't know, what she didn't tell me until much later, was that we'd built something together when she was 16, right after her parents died, back when she used to stay with me on weekends, because the house she shared with her aunt felt too quiet for a grieving kid. Well, we'd come up with a phrase half as a joke, half because I'd spent years training people on threat recognition and couldn't turn that part of myself off even with a teenager. If you ever need me and can't say it straight out, just tell me the porch light's flickering. I'll come. She'd laughed about it back then, called me overprotective. I told her overprotective men live longer, and so do the people they protect. That night, my phone rang at 9:42. I remember the exact time because I just turned off the television and the silence of the house had that particular weight it always had since Loretta died. I almost let it go to voicemail. Hannah didn't call much anymore, not since Tyler started commenting on how often she talked to me. When I picked up, her voice was too bright, too rehearsed, the kind of cheerful that doesn't match a person's breathing. "Hey, Grandpa. Just wanted to say goodnight. Oh, and hey, the porch light's flickering again. Might want to get that looked at. For half a second, I thought she meant the actual porch light. Then the years folded back on themselves and I felt my stomach drop straight through the floor. In the background, faint but unmistakable, I heard Tyler's voice, sharp and slurred. "Who are you talking to?" Then the line went dead. I didn't think after that. I moved. Boots on, keys in hand, truck started before I'd even fully registered standing up. The drive to their place takes 11 minutes on a good day. I don't know how fast I made it, but my old Chevy rattled over every pothole on Route 9 like it was trying to shake itself apart, and I barely felt it. My hands were steady on the wheel, even though my heart was doing something it hadn't done since my last deployment with the task force, 15 years earlier. The night we breached a house in Tulsa, not knowing if the man inside had a weapon or a hostage or both. When I pulled up, the porch light actually was flickering, the bulb half blown, swinging slightly from a chain I'd helped Hannah hang myself 2 summers back. Through the front window, I could see shapes moving. Fast, wrong. I didn't knock. I went around to the side door, the one that sticks unless you lift the handle just right, something only family would know. Tyler had Hannah backed against the kitchen counter, one hand gripping her upper arm hard enough that I could see her flinch even through the glass. He was yelling something about her phone, about who she'd been texting, about how she thought she was so smart. She wasn't crying. She had the flat, frozen look of someone who'd learned that crying made it worse. I came through that door the way I'd come through 100 doors before. Quiet, low, no wasted motion. Tyler didn't see me until Hannah's eyes shifted past his shoulder and went wide. "Grandpa," she said, barely a whisper. Tyler spun around, and for one strange second he actually smiled. The kind of smile men like him give right before they decide you're not a real threat. "Look who showed up," he said, words thick with whatever he'd been drinking. "The old farmer. You gonna lecture me too?" I told him to let go of her arm. He laughed and told me to mind my own business, that this was between him and his wife. I said it again, slower. "Let go of her arm." He shoved her toward the table instead, hard enough that she knocked into a chair, and that was the only invitation I needed. People think violence announces itself with shouting. It doesn't, not the kind that matters. Tyler took one step toward me, chest puffed out, and the moment his weight shifted forward onto his lead foot, training that's older than most of his life took over mine. I caught his wrist, turned with him instead of against him, and put him face down on the kitchen tile before he understood what had happened. He cursed, thrashed, called me an old psycho. I kept my knee light but immovable against his shoulder blade, the same pressure I'd been taught decades ago and never forgot, enough to control, never enough to injure unless he forced it. "You're not hurt," I told him calmly. "You're restrained. Those are different things." That made him angrier, which told me everything about the kind of man he was. Hannah stood frozen by the table, both hands pressed over her mouth, until the flashing lights came through the front windows and she finally moved, running to unlock the door for the deputies. The 2 officers came in fast, weapons low and ready, and I did exactly what I'd trained 100 rookies to do in that situation. I released one hand from Tyler's wrist and raised it slow and open. "Sheriff's Department," one of them called. "Victim secure, suspect restrained. I'm former federal law enforcement," I said, keeping my voice level. The older deputy's eyes moved over the whole scene in under 2 seconds. My stance, my breathing, the precise economy of how I had Tyler controlled without a mark on him, and something shifted in his face. Recognition, not of who I was, but of what I'd clearly once done for a living. "Sir, can you stand up for me? Nice and slow," he said, and his tone had changed completely. I did. Tyler immediately rolled over and started yelling that I'd attacked him out of nowhere, that he was the victim here, and the younger deputy looked at him with an expression somewhere between disbelief and disgust before turning to Hannah instead. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" Hannah's voice cracked on the single word yes. And that was the moment the whole room reorganized itself around the truth. They cuffed Tyler while he was still shouting that this was insane, that I couldn't just barge into someone's house. Nobody was listening to him anymore. Hannah finally broke, sliding down against the counter, sobbing in the way people do when fear they've been holding for months finally has somewhere to go. I grabbed the throw blanket off the back of the couch, the same kind of thing I used to do for her when she was 16, and woke up from nightmares about the accident that took her parents, and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You're safe," I told her. "I've got you." She grabbed onto my shirt with both fists, and I felt something in my chest crack open that I'd kept welded shut since Loretta's funeral. Because a man can spend his whole career learning to read danger in strangers and still miss it sitting across the dinner table from someone he loves. The older deputy found me on the porch afterward while the paramedics checked Hannah's arm for bruising. "You federal?" he asked, low and respectful. I nodded. "Marshal service, retired." He looked back toward the kitchen, then at me again. "You handled that about as clean as I've ever seen it handled." I didn't say anything to that. Clean. As if this had been a job instead of my own granddaughter standing in her own kitchen with finger-shaped bruises starting to bloom on her arm. I should have asked more questions months ago. I should have pushed past the polite answers. That thought sat in my chest like a stone the whole drive home, after I'd convinced Hannah to come stay with me, at least for a few nights, at least until things settled. The first morning after, I woke before sunrise the way I had every day for 40 years, and made coffee in a kitchen that suddenly didn't feel as quiet as it had the night before. Hannah came down in one of Loretta's old cardigans she must have found in the hall closet, and the bruise on her arm had darkened overnight into something ugly and undeniable. She wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, pouring her coffee. "For what?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. "For all of this. For not telling you it had gotten this bad." That answer told me more about how long she'd been carrying this than anything else could have. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slow, the way you do when you don't want to spook someone. "You don't owe me an apology, Hannah girl." Her eyes filled fast and she looked away. I kept thinking if I just didn't make him mad, it would go back to how it was at the start. I told her that wasn't how men like Tyler worked. That calm on her part was never going to be the fix, because the problem was never really about her. She nodded slowly, but I could see she didn't fully believe it yet. Belief like that takes longer than one conversation. I wasn't exactly an easy man to be raised around either, and I told her that sitting at that table. After Loretta died, I disappeared into routines the same way I disappeared into deployments years before that, the same way men of my generation were taught to handle grief, which is to say, we didn't handle it, we just outran it. Fixed engines. Mowed the same patch of grass twice a week, whether it needed it or not. Hannah had needed me during some of that, and I'd been present in body and absent in everything else. I told her I was sorry for that too, and something about an old man admitting fault seemed to loosen something in her. Because that afternoon, sitting on the back porch with 2 mugs of tea going cold between us, she finally started talking, really talking. "He wasn't always like this," she said quietly, watching the goats graze in the side pasture. "At first he was funny, attentive, made me feel like the only person in the room." I told her that's usually how it starts. She nodded like she already knew that now, the hard way. Then it was little things. He didn't like my friend Becca, said she was a bad influence. Then it was what I wore to work. Then it was how much I talked when we were out with people. I listened without interrupting because I'd learned a long time ago that people don't need you to fix the sentence. They need you to let them finish it. If dinner wasn't ready when he got home, he'd go quiet for the whole night. The silent treatment, like I didn't exist. Then eventually, quiet turned into yelling, and the yelling turned into, "She didn't finish that one. She didn't have to." The first time he grabbed me hard enough to leave a mark, he cried after, she said. Said it was the stress from work. Said it would never happen again. I closed my eyes for a second. Apology, excuse, a stretch of forced kindness, then escalation. I'd seen that pattern in case files for years. I just never expected to see it in my own family. I kept thinking if I got better at handling him, it would stop. She said, "I know now that's not how it works." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I was embarrassed, Grandpa. I didn't want you to think I'd picked the wrong man after everything you and Grandma went through." That last part hurt worse than anything Tyler had done to her arm, because Loretta had been gentle in all the ways I wasn't, warm where I ran cold and disciplined, and I think Hannah inherited that softness from her grandmother in a way that made her an easy target for a man who mistook kindness for weakness. A few days later, Detective Marshal Reyes came by the house, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, the kind of patience that comes from having sat across from 100 frightened people before. She laid out what they'd found going through Tyler's phone. A pattern of messages to friends bragging about keeping Hannah in line. Financial records showing he'd been quietly draining her savings account for months. Hannah sat twisting a paper napkin in her lap, and then said something that surprised both of us. "There's more." She went up to her room and came back down with an old phone, one she'd kept hidden in a shoebox. I started recording some of our fights after the first time he put his hands on me. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just knew I needed proof, in case anybody ever asked me if I was lying. The detective played one clip. 40 seconds, Tyler's voice rising, something breaking against a wall. Hannah's voice, small and pleading. Then one sentence on the recording made my blood go cold. If your grandfather ever sticks his nose in our business again, he's going to regret it. The detective looked up at me carefully after that one. Sir, that's going to matter a great deal in this case. Hannah looked ashamed again, said she felt wrong for recording him without his knowledge. The detective shook her head firmly. Honey, surviving someone isn't a crime. Documenting it isn't either. I watched something in Hannah's shoulders ease just slightly, like she'd been given permission she didn't know she needed. That evening, after the detective left, I went out to my workshop in the barn and sat at the bench for a long time without turning on a single tool. The old memories came back the way they always do after something cracks the dam, not all at once, but in pieces. Doors I'd kicked in not knowing what was waiting. A partner I'd lost on a warrant gone bad outside Muskogee. The careful way you train yourself to compartmentalize fear because the job requires it, and how that same skill, so useful on the job, had maybe cost me something at home, made me a man who could read a room full of armed strangers, but somehow missed the warning signs, sitting right across the dinner table from his own granddaughter for over a year. Hannah found me out there in the dark. Couldn't sleep either, she said, and sat down on the old stool beside the bench. We listened to the rain on the tin roof for a minute before she asked, out of nowhere, were you ever scared, doing your job? Nobody had asked me that in a long time. All the time, I told her honestly. She looked surprised. But you were a marshal. You went after dangerous people for a living. Training doesn't erase fear, I told her. It just teaches you what to do with it while it's happening. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, very softly, I was scared every single day with Tyler. I reached over and put my hand over hers. You don't have to be scared anymore. Not in this house, not ever again. She leaned her head against my shoulder the way she used to when she was 16 and missing her parents, and cried herself calm. The preliminary hearing came in late autumn, gray sky, that particular cold that settles into older joints and doesn't leave. Hannah sat beside me outside the courtroom, holding a paper cup of coffee with both hands like it was the only warm thing left in the world. Inside, Tyler looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but in the way a man looks once consequences finally catch up to him. His suit didn't fit as well as it used to. His parents sat behind him, looking exhausted, and I felt an unexpected flicker of sympathy for them because no parent raises a child hoping he'll become someone like this. His attorney did exactly what I'd seen defense attorneys do 100 times in my old line of work, painting Tyler as a stress provider, pushed to his limits, and then turning toward me, accusing me of having used excessive and unnecessary force against an unarmed man in his own home. I sat perfectly still through it. I'd testified before. Performance doesn't move evidence. The prosecution laid out the bruising photographs, the medical records, the audio recordings, neighbor statements about raised voices through thin apartment walls, and then the body camera footage, which showed exactly what had happened in that kitchen: calm restraint, no excessive force, just containment until help arrived. I watched the defense attorney's confidence visibly drain out of the room as that footage played. Tyler still wasn't finished embarrassing himself. On the stand, he blamed the alcohol, the stress of running 3 dealerships, Hannah's emotional instability, anything except the actual choices he'd made with his own hands. Then he looked straight at me and said I'd turned his wife against him, that I'd never accepted him into the family. Something in Hannah hardened at that. She stood before the prosecutor had even finished his question. No, she said, voice shaking at first and then steadying with every word. My grandfather didn't turn me against anyone. He saved my life. The courtroom went silent. She described, in detail, that made one of the jurors openly wipe her eyes, the isolation, the walking on eggshells, the slow erosion of a person she used to recognize in the mirror. I stopped knowing who I was during that marriage, she said, and that line went through me harder than anything I'd carried home from 17 years of federal work, because the job had taught me about wounds that bleed. Nobody had taught me about the kind that just quietly erase a person while they're still standing right in front of you. During a recess, the prosecutor, A sharp young woman named Diane Okafor found me by the vending machines. "You were federal law enforcement, weren't you?" she said. I asked how she could tell. "My uncle was a marshal for 20 years out of the Eastern District. You all carry yourselves the same way." Then she got more serious. "The restraint you showed that night probably saved this whole case. If you'd lost your temper and really hurt him, the defense would have spent the entire trial making this about you instead of him." I told her she was right, and I meant it. Revenge feels good for about 30 seconds. Control protects the people you love for a lot longer than that. It took me most of my adult life to fully believe that. The sentencing hearing was 6 weeks later. Hannah almost didn't go, but in the end she said she needed to see it through, needed the closure of watching it finish properly. That morning I went up to the attic and pulled down the old garment bag holding my marshal's dress uniform, something I hadn't worn since Loretta's funeral. When I'd put on just the jacket, because she always said it reminded her there was still a serious man underneath all my quiet. The fabric smelled like cedar and years. I pinned the service pins back on one at a time, and the memories came with them. Partners I'd lost, doors I'd gone through, not knowing what waited. The particular silence of a command center after a warrant went bad. When I walked into that courthouse in full uniform, conversations actually stopped. Even Hannah stared. "You never wear that," she whispered. "I know," I said. "Maybe I needed to today." Tyler's face, when he saw me, went through something close to genuine fear for the first time since I'd known him. Not because of anything I might do, but because he finally understood what kind of man had been sitting quietly across the table at every family dinner he'd ever half paid attention to. The judge reviewed everything carefully and then asked if I wished to make a statement. I stood, slower than I used to, every joint reminding me I wasn't young anymore, but my voice held steady. I told that courtroom I'd spent most of my career around danger, around people who'd convinced themselves that fear was the same thing as respect. I told them that one thing 17 years on the job and 66 years on this earth had taught me is that strength has nothing to do with making the people around you afraid. Real strength is protecting the people who can't protect themselves yet. I looked toward Tyler and told him, honestly, that I didn't hate him. I hated what he'd chosen to become, hated what he'd done to my granddaughter. But hatred left unchecked does more damage to the person carrying it than the person it's aimed at. I asked the court for accountability, not destruction. That distinction mattered to me. The sentence included real prison time, mandatory substance treatment, a domestic violence intervention program, and a permanent restraining order. As the deputies let him out, he stopped near the door and looked back at Hannah, and for the first time the tears on his face looked real instead of performed. "I'm sorry," he said. She didn't answer him. She just held my hand and watched him disappear through those doors. And for the first time in longer than I think either of us had realized, the fear behind her eyes was finally gone. Healing at our age, and frankly at any age, doesn't move in a straight line. Winter passed slow. By the following spring, Hannah had found a small apartment above a flower shop downtown, run by a widow named Pearl, who treated her like a granddaughter from day one. The place wasn't much, but it had good morning light and a lock that worked, and that mattered more than square footage. She went back to part-time work at the community college library, nervous at first that people would whisper about the trial, but small towns surprise you sometimes, especially the older women who'd lived long enough themselves to recognize quiet pain when they saw it walking past the circulation desk. I changed too, in ways I hadn't expected. For years after Loretta died, I'd shrunk my whole world down to a tractor, a fishing pole, and a television set, and called that peace, when really it was just a slower kind of hiding. After everything with Hannah, that same quiet started to feel less like comfort and more like loneliness. An old friend from the task force, a retired investigator named Dale, talked me into showing up at the Tuesday breakfast the local VFW post ran, and I went mostly to get him to stop asking. Turns out old lawmen and old soldiers laugh a lot more than people expect. We talked about grandkids, blood pressure medication, boat motors that wouldn't turn over, hardly ever about the job itself. Most of us, it turns out, spend our later years grateful for ordinary mornings, not reliving the dangerous ones. That same spring, Hannah brought her younger half-brother Cody over for Sunday dinner, a wiry, freckled 11-year-old who'd been living with their aunt since their parents' accident, and who Tyler had always found excuses to keep at arm's length, calling him too much whenever Hannah wanted him around. Now Cody ran through my yard like he'd always belonged there. We sat by the pond behind the house one afternoon, fishing for bluegill, and he studied me for a long while before asking, "Hannah says you used to chase bad guys for the government." "Something like that," I told him, smiling. "She says you took down her ex like an action movie." I told him his sister tended to exaggerate. He insisted she didn't. Then he went quiet, the way kids do right before they ask the question that's actually been sitting on their chest. "Why was Tyler so mean to her?" I looked out over the water before I answered. "Sometimes people carry around an anger they were never taught how to manage," I told him, "and they take it out on whoever's closest and safest to hurt." "Did he hate her?" "No," I said, and that's the saddest part of it. Some people confuse loving someone with controlling them. Cody considered that with more seriousness than most adults manage, then nodded slowly. A little while later, I handed him the rod. "You know what real strength looks like?" "What?" "Making the people around you feel safe, not scared." He grinned wide when he reeled in a small bluegill a few minutes after that. And at 11 years old, he already understood something it had taken me decades to learn properly. One evening that summer, Hannah showed up at my door holding an envelope with no return address, just a prison stamp. She sat at the kitchen table while I opened it. The letter was handwritten, the printing uneven in places. No excuses this time, just plain honesty about his drinking, his insecurity, the way he'd learned to mistake control for love from his own father. One line stood out enough that I read it twice. "I spent years trying to feel like a man by making the people who love me feel small." Hannah watched me finish reading. "What do you think?" she asked quietly. I folded it carefully and told her remorse, when it's real, is a painful thing to witness. "Do you forgive him?" That question hung in the kitchen a long while. At my age, I've learned forgiveness isn't a switch you flip once. It's a decision you make again and again, sometimes daily, sometimes through gritted teeth. I told her I didn't know yet, and she said that was fair. Then, after a long quiet, she said something that nearly undid me completely. "Thank you for coming that night, Grandpa. Thank you for saving me." I told her the truth, which is that I hadn't saved her alone. She'd saved herself the moment she found the courage to send that signal instead of staying silent. That takes its own kind of bravery, the kind most people never find. A few Sundays later, the whole family gathered around my table again. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, the cornbread recipe Loretta used to make from memory. Sunlight came through the kitchen windows while Cody laughed at something on the television in the other room, and Hannah looked peaceful in a way I hadn't seen since before any of this started. Not perform calm, not survival mode, just real peace. Sitting there listening to plates clinking and family voices filling a house that had been too quiet for too long, I finally understood something it had taken me nearly 7 decades to fully grasp. When I was young, I thought strength meant winning the fight. The job taught me strength meant surviving the dangerous nights and getting back up the next morning. But growing old, really old, taught me the truest version of it. Strength is picking up the phone when someone you love is afraid. Strength is staying calm when rage would be so much easier. Strength is protecting the people in your life without losing the gentleness that made them trust you in the first place. And sometimes strength is finally letting yourself heal too, instead of just standing guard forever. If any part of this reached you tonight, if you've ever protected someone you love or learned a hard lesson far too late in life, I hope you'll pass it along to someone who might need to hear it. And remember, it is never too late, at any age, to choose kindness over control, peace over pride, and love over fear. Sometimes the people who love us hardest are the quietest about it, carrying old wounds so we never have to. A single phone call, a code word remembered from years ago, can be the thread that pulls someone back from the edge. Showing up matters more than explaining yourself ever will. And it's never too late to trade silence for presence, control for tenderness, fear for the kind of love that simply stays. A small note for you. This story was imagined and written by AI for entertainment purposes, though we hope its gentle message about showing up for the people we love stays with you.